Sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the one that changes the course of an entire life. No one in the quiet farming town of Ashford believed that anymore. People were too busy counting dollars, chasing deadlines, and judging strangers by the rust on their trucks. Caleb Hayes had stopped expecting fairness years ago. At 32, he measured success differently. If the lights stayed on, if his 8-year-old son Owen laughed before bed, and if there was enough bacon left for breakfast on Saturday morning, then life had already given him more than enough. His little auto garage sat just outside town beside an old two-lane highway, where forgotten travelers drifted through like tumbleweeds. The faded wooden sign above the entrance leaned slightly to one side, its peeling letters barely visible beneath years of rain and summer heat. Most people drove past without slowing down. The ones who stopped usually couldn't afford expensive repairs. Caleb never minded. He believed broken machines deserved patience, just like broken people. Late one crisp October afternoon, while amber sunlight spilled across the cracked pavement and the smell of fallen maple leaves drifted through the open garage doors, the familiar rumble of an aging engine echoed down the road. A weathered olive-green Jeep CJ rolled slowly into the parking lot before coughing once and falling silent. Its paint had faded beneath decades of sun. Small scratches covered the doors like old memories, and a tiny American flag fluttered gently from the antenna. Behind the wheel sat an elderly man wearing a brown flight jacket decorated with carefully stitched military patches. His silver hair peeked beneath a faded baseball cap embroidered with tiny golden wings. He climbed out carefully, resting one steady hand against the Jeep's hood before smiling with quiet pride. "Guess she finally decided she'd had enough," the old man said with a soft laugh. Caleb wiped grease from his hands and walked over. "Let's see what she's trying to tell us." The older man introduced himself as Walter Dawson. He explained that the Jeep had carried him across thousands of miles after retiring from the Air Force decades earlier. It had been with him through road trips, family vacations, lonely anniversaries, and every visit to his late wife's favorite lake. "She's more family than transportation," Walter admitted quietly. Caleb nodded without asking another question. Some things didn't need explaining. He lifted the hood carefully, studying every hose, every wire, every worn bolt as though examining an old photograph instead of an engine. Minutes stretched into nearly 2 hours. The October breeze cooled the afternoon while Owen sat nearby, finishing homework at an old wooden workbench, occasionally looking up with quiet curiosity as his father worked. Finally, Caleb tightened one last clamp, replaced a cracked fuel line from spare parts already sitting on his shelf, and gently turned the ignition key. The old Jeep shuddered once before the engine settled into a smooth, confident rumble that sounded almost grateful. Walter's tired eyes brightened. He rested both hands on the steering wheel, listening in silence before whispering, "That's exactly how she used to sound." He reached slowly for his worn leather wallet. "Son, tell me what I owe you." Caleb smiled and gently pushed the wallet back toward him. "Nothing." Walter frowned. "Nothing." Caleb closed the hood with careful hands. "A machine that carried someone home safely for years deserves another chance. Besides, some things are worth more than money." The old pilot studied him for a long moment, saying nothing. Then a quiet smile crossed his face, one that seemed to carry decades of memories. He climbed back into the Jeep, paused with one hand on the wheel, and looked through the open window. "Tomorrow morning," Walter said softly, "someone's going to come looking for you." Before Caleb could ask what he meant, the restored Jeep rolled onto the highway, disappearing beyond the golden trees while the fading sunlight painted the road ahead in colors that somehow felt like the beginning of something neither man could yet understand. The next morning arrived wrapped in a pale blue sky that promised another cool autumn day. Dew clung to the grass surrounding the little garage, and the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the open office window as Caleb unlocked the front door before sunrise. Routine had become the rhythm that carried him through every season. He swept yesterday's dust from the concrete floor, rolled up the garage doors, and watched the first rays of sunlight creep across shelves lined with worn tools that had belonged to his father. Owen wandered in a few minutes later wearing his favorite blue hoodie, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, while carrying 2 breakfast burritos wrapped in foil from the diner down the road. "Miss Evelyn gave us an extra cinnamon roll," Owen said proudly. Caleb smiled. "Then we had better earn it." The boy laughed and climbed onto his usual stool beside the workbench, opening his school notebook while the old radio quietly played classic country songs in the background. Everything felt ordinary, almost too ordinary. Yet Walter's final words lingered in Caleb's thoughts like an unfinished sentence. "Someone is going to come looking for you." He shook his head and laughed softly to himself. The old pilot had probably meant another veteran needing help with an old truck. Small towns had a way of making simple things sound mysterious. At exactly 8:15, the peaceful morning changed. A low hum echoed across the highway. Then another. Then another. Caleb looked up from replacing brake pads on an aging pickup. 3 glossy black sport utility vehicles turned off the highway one after another, rolling slowly toward the garage with quiet precision. They stopped in a perfect line beside the faded building, their polished paint reflecting the morning sun so brightly that neighboring shop owners stepped outside to see what was happening. Curtains shifted in nearby houses. A delivery driver parked his van without unloading a single package. Even the waitress from the diner across the street paused in the doorway, coffee pot still in her hand. Nobody in Ashford had ever seen vehicles like these arrive together. The rear door of the middle vehicle opened first. A young woman stepped onto the gravel wearing a tailored ivory coat over a navy dress, her golden hair catching the sunlight as the breeze gently moved a few loose strands across her shoulders. She looked no older than 28, calm and composed, yet there was nothing arrogant about the way she carried herself. Her eyes scanned the modest garage with quiet attention rather than judgment. Behind her stood 2 professionally dressed assistants who remained respectfully several steps back. Owen whispered without looking away, "Dad, do you know her?" Caleb wiped his hands on a clean shop towel. "No, buddy. I do not think I have ever seen her before." The woman walked forward at an unhurried pace until she stood only a few feet away. She glanced briefly at the repaired pickup, then at the neatly organized tools hanging on the wall before meeting Caleb's eyes. "Good morning," she said with a warm but measured smile. "My name is Audrey Mitchell." Caleb offered a polite handshake. "Caleb Hayes. How can I help you?" Instead of answering immediately, Audrey looked toward the highway where Walter's Jeep had disappeared the evening before. A thoughtful expression crossed her face before she turned back to Caleb. "I am looking for the man who repaired a retired pilot's Jeep yesterday without accepting a single dollar." Caleb blinked in surprise. "That was me." Audrey nodded slowly as though confirming something deeply important. "Then I finally found the right person." Around them, the town remained unusually quiet. Nobody understood why one of the most successful business leaders in the country had traveled hundreds of miles to stand in front of a forgotten roadside garage. Caleb certainly did not. But as the autumn wind stirred the American flag hanging above the entrance, he suddenly realized Walter's words had not been a guess. They had been a promise. Caleb stood motionless for a moment, uncertain whether he should wipe the remaining grease from his hands again or simply pretend this extraordinary morning was somehow ordinary. Audrey Mitchell noticed his hesitation and offered a gentle smile that carried neither pity nor superiority. "May we speak inside?" she asked quietly. Caleb nodded and held the office door open for her, while Owen politely moved his school books to make room at the small wooden table. The office was humble. Family. Photographs lined one wall. A faded map of America hung beside an old calendar. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with motor oil and pine cleaner, creating the familiar scent Caleb had known almost his entire life. Audrey looked around with genuine curiosity rather than discomfort. Her eyes paused on a framed photograph of a smiling young woman holding a newborn Owen. Caleb noticed the glance, but said nothing. Some memories were better left undisturbed. One of Audrey's assistants carefully placed a slim leather folder on the desk before stepping back without speaking. Audrey remained standing. "Mr. Dawson told me exactly what happened yesterday," she began. "He also told me something even more important. He said you refused payment before you knew anything about him." Caleb shrugged lightly. He needed help. That was enough. Audrey studied him for several quiet seconds, almost as though she were measuring the weight of those simple words. Outside, curious neighbors continued watching through the garage entrance, whispering among themselves while pretending to check mailboxes or walk their dogs. Ashford had become unusually silent, the kind of silence that arrived just before something unforgettable happened. Audrey slowly opened the leather folder. Instead of a check or business proposal, she removed an old black and white photograph with slightly worn edges. She slid it across the desk toward Caleb. It showed 6 Air Force pilots standing proudly beside a weathered military jeep. Walter Dawson appeared much younger, smiling beneath a bright summer sky. Caleb admired the photograph before handing it back. That jeep has certainly seen better days. Audrey nodded softly. It has. Then her expression changed. What you repaired yesterday was never simply an old vehicle. Caleb looked at her with growing curiosity. What do you mean? Audrey glanced toward the closed office window before lowering her voice. That jeep has remained exactly as it returned from its final mission nearly 40 years ago. Every scratch, every replacement bolt, every worn panel has been preserved for a reason. Caleb frowned slightly. Then I hope I did not change anything important. Audrey surprised him by smiling. You did the opposite. Walter said you repaired only what was necessary and left everything else untouched. Most restoration shops would have replaced half the vehicle. Caleb answered honestly. History deserves respect. Sometimes repairing too much erases the story. Audrey looked down for a brief moment, and something almost emotional flickered across her face before disappearing again. That is exactly what Walter hoped you would say. Owen listened quietly from the corner, sensing that this conversation carried a meaning far beyond old engines. Then Audrey reached into the folder one final time and placed a small brass compass on the desk. It was beautifully polished, but obviously decades old. The initials WD were engraved on one side, while an unfamiliar set of numbers had been carefully etched into the back. Walter asked me to give this to you only if you were the one who repaired the Jeep, she said. Caleb picked it up carefully. The compass needle still pointed steadily north despite its age. What do these numbers mean? Audrey slowly shook her head. I do not know. Walter never explained them to anyone. That answer was true, but not complete. Hidden beneath the felt lining inside the leather folder rested another photograph Audrey chose not to reveal. It showed the very same Jeep parked outside this exact garage nearly 3 decades earlier, and standing beside it was a much younger man whose face looked strangely familiar. Audrey quietly closed the folder before Caleb could notice. Some truths, Walter had insisted, had to wait until the right moment. And if he was right, the greatest surprise in this story had not even begun. Caleb turned the brass compass over in his hands, tracing the engraved numbers with his thumb while the tiny needle remained perfectly steady. He had repaired thousands of engines over the years, yet this small object somehow carried more weight than any piece of machinery he had ever touched. He carefully placed it on the desk. I appreciate you bringing this, he said, but I still do not understand why I am involved. Audrey folded the leather folder and rested both hands on top of it. Because Walter believes character reveals itself long before opportunity arrives. Caleb gave a modest smile. I only fixed a fuel line. No, Audrey replied gently. You respected something that mattered to another person without expecting recognition. That is much harder to find than someone who knows how to repair an engine. Silence settled over the office. Outside, the curious crowd had grown larger, though everyone pretended to mind their own business. Owen quietly packed away his homework, sensing the conversation was becoming more important with every passing minute. Audrey finally reached into her coat pocket and removed a simple key attached to a faded leather tag. She placed it beside the compass. I would like to hire you. Caleb looked at the key, confused. For what? There is an old warehouse about 40 miles from here. Inside is a vehicle that has not been started in nearly 20 years. Walter wants only one person to inspect it before anyone else touches it. Caleb leaned back slightly. There are restoration shops with bigger crews and far better equipment than mine. Audrey smiled. Walter has already rejected every one of them. Why? Because they all promise perfection. He is looking for someone who understands preservation instead of replacement. Caleb glanced toward the garage where his customers' vehicles waited. I cannot simply close my shop for several days. Before Audrey could answer, Owen spoke quietly from the corner. Dad, Mr. Jenkins said his truck is not due until Friday. Caleb looked at his son with surprise. The boy had been paying attention to the work schedule all along. Audrey noticed the exchange and smiled again, this time with unmistakable admiration. Your son notices everything. Caleb laughed softly. Sometimes more than I do. Audrey stood and walked slowly toward the office window. She watched an elderly couple wave at Caleb from across the street, and he instinctively waved back. "Do you know every person in this town?" she asked. "Most of them." "Do they know you?" Caleb shrugged. "Enough to trust me with their cars." Audrey turned back toward him. "Trust is becoming rare." She paused before adding, "Walter says it is the most valuable thing anyone can restore." Those words lingered in the room long after she finished speaking. Then she handed Caleb a cream-colored envelope with no company logo, no return address, and only his name written neatly across the front. "Please do not open this until tonight after Owen is asleep," she said. Caleb frowned. "Can you at least tell me what is inside?" Audrey hesitated just long enough to make the question feel important. "It is not a contract. It is not money. It is simply something Walter believes you should read when the house is quiet." Caleb accepted the envelope but made no promise. He disliked secrets almost as much as unfinished repairs. As Audrey prepared to leave, she stopped beside the garage entrance and looked once more at the old family photographs hanging inside the office. For the briefest moment, her expression softened into quiet recognition before she looked away. Caleb did not notice it, but Owen did. Later that evening, he would remember that single glance and wonder why a stranger had looked at his family's pictures as though she had seen them somewhere long before that morning. A question that would not find its answer until every hidden piece of Walter's remarkable plan finally came together. That evening, the little house felt quieter than usual. A gentle rain tapped against the kitchen window while the smell of homemade chicken soup filled the air. Caleb and Owen ate dinner together at the small oak table that had served 3 generations of the Hayes family. They talked about school, baseball, and whether the maple tree in the backyard would lose all of its leaves before Halloween. Nothing in their conversation hinted that the ordinary life they treasured was slowly moving towards something extraordinary. After washing the dishes together, Caleb helped Owen finish reading a chapter from his favorite adventure book before tucking him into bed. "Do you think that lady will come back?" Owen asked sleepily. Caleb smiled as he pulled the blanket over his son's shoulders. "I honestly do not know. I think Grandpa Walter knows something nobody else does." Caleb laughed quietly. "Maybe he does." Owen closed his eyes. "If he trusts you, I trust him too." Those simple words stayed with Caleb as he quietly closed the bedroom door. The house settled into peaceful silence. Only then did he remember the cream-colored envelope resting on the kitchen counter exactly where Audrey had left it. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat beneath the warm glow of an old hanging lamp, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was not a contract or legal document. Instead, he found a single handwritten letter on thick stationery. Walter's familiar handwriting filled the page with calm, steady lines. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then you chose patience over curiosity, and that tells me I judged your character correctly." Caleb smiled without realizing it. Walter continued by explaining that every meaningful restoration begins with understanding the story before touching the machine. "People," he wrote, "should be treated the same way." Near the bottom of the page, another sentence caught Caleb's attention. "Tomorrow, Audrey will ask you to examine something that belongs to history. I am not asking you to restore it. I am asking you to decide whether it should be restored at all." Caleb read the sentence twice. It was an unusual request. Most owners wanted vehicles returned to perfect condition. Walter seemed to value authenticity more than appearance. Folded behind the letter was a small hand-drawn map leading to an old aircraft storage facility several counties away. One corner of the map contained the same mysterious numbers engraved on the brass compass. Caleb compared them carefully. They matched exactly. He turned the compass over again, watching the needle settle toward north before placing both items side by side on the table. There had to be a connection, but he could not see it yet. Early the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, Audrey returned alone in a modest gray pickup instead of the black convoy. The expensive coat had been replaced by a simple canvas jacket and work boots. She stepped into the garage, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner across the street. "I thought today felt more like coffee than board meetings," she said with a friendly smile. Caleb accepted the cup with quiet appreciation. "Thank you." She noticed the folded letter resting on his workbench. "So you opened it?" "I did." "And?" Caleb looked toward the old highway stretching beyond the garage doors. "I still have more questions than answers." Audrey nodded as though that was exactly the response she expected. "Good. Walter always says the people with all the answers usually stop listening. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a small brass key with a faded red tag marked Hangar 12. Are you ready to meet the vehicle he spent 40 years protecting? Caleb looked at the key, then at the compass resting beside Walter's letter. Neither object seemed valuable on its own, yet together they felt like pieces of a puzzle someone had started assembling decades before either of them realized they would become part of the same story. The drive to the old airfield took just under an hour, carrying Caleb and Audrey along quiet county roads bordered by golden cornfields and weathered red barns that had stood for generations. Morning sunlight spilled across the windshield while the brass compass rested in Caleb's jacket pocket, its steady weight reminding him that this journey had begun with nothing more than a free repair for a stranger. Audrey drove without rushing, occasionally pointing toward familiar landmarks from her childhood. My father used to bring me out here on weekends, she said softly. He always told me history is not something you read. It is something you protect. Caleb nodded thoughtfully. Walter seems to believe the same thing. Neither of them spoke for several miles after that. The silence felt comfortable, filled only by the steady hum of the tires against the pavement and the distant cries of migrating geese crossing the clear autumn sky. Eventually, they turned through an aging chain-link gate marked with a faded government sign that had long since lost most of its paint. Beyond it stood a quiet collection of unused hangars surrounded by wide stretches of cracked concrete, where weeds pushed stubbornly through narrow seams. Time itself seemed to move more slowly there. Audrey, parked beside a weathered steel building with large white numbers painted across its sliding doors. 12. She reached into her jacket and handed Caleb the brass key. Walter insisted that only you should unlock it. Caleb hesitated. Should not you be the one to do this? Audrey smiled gently. This is your test, not mine. Caleb walked toward the heavy door, inserted the old key, and turned it slowly. The lock clicked with surprising ease. Together they pushed the massive doors apart, and sunlight streamed into the dark interior, revealing floating dust that shimmered like tiny stars suspended in still air. Gradually the shape inside emerged from the shadows beneath a carefully preserved canvas cover. Audrey stepped forward and folded the fabric back with quiet respect. Beneath it rested a beautifully preserved 1968 Ford Bronco finished in deep forest green, its chrome trim softly reflecting the morning light. The vehicle looked untouched for decades, yet every detail had been carefully protected. A folded American flag rested neatly on the passenger seat beside a leather flight helmet and a pair of worn aviator gloves. Caleb slowly circled the Bronco without touching it. He crouched beside one tire, examined the engine compartment through a narrow gap, and finally stepped back. The mechanical work is not the difficult part, he said quietly. Audrey watched him closely. Then what is? Caleb looked around the silent hangar before answering. Someone spent years preserving every memory connected to this vehicle. If I make it look brand new, I erase the fingerprints of everyone who cared for it before today. Audrey lowered her eyes, and for the first time since arriving in Ashford, emotion broke through her calm professional composure. Walter said you might answer exactly like that. She opened a small storage cabinet against the far wall and removed an old maintenance log filled with handwritten notes dating back decades. Most entries described oil changes, tire rotations, and careful inspections, but one page contained only a single sentence written in Walter's unmistakable handwriting. Caleb read it aloud. The right mechanic will know when not to restore what time has already perfected. He slowly closed the logbook. This Bronco does not need a restoration. It needs preservation and respect. Audrey smiled through glistening eyes. Then you passed the only test that ever mattered. Before Caleb could respond, his attention shifted to a small brass emblem mounted discreetly beneath the dashboard. It matched the engraving on Walter's compass exactly, including the same mysterious numbers. Audrey noticed his expression but remained silent. She knew what the symbol meant, yet Walter had made one instruction perfectly clear. The truth hidden behind those numbers could only be revealed after Caleb made every important decision without knowing why it mattered. When Caleb and Audrey stepped back into the crisp afternoon sunlight, neither of them spoke for several moments. The quiet airfield seemed untouched by time, its empty runways stretching toward the horizon beneath a brilliant blue sky. Caleb glanced back at Hangar 12 before Audrey carefully locked the heavy steel doors once again. Walter has protected this place for a very long time, he said. Audrey nodded. Longer than most people realize. As they walked toward the gray pickup, Caleb slipped the brass compass back into his jacket pocket. The engraved numbers, the matching emblem beneath the Bronco's dashboard, and Walter's handwritten letter refused to leave his thoughts. The pieces fit together too perfectly to be coincidence, yet the picture they formed remained incomplete. During the drive back to Ashford, Audrey finally broke the silence. May I ask you something personal? Caleb looked out the passenger window at fields glowing beneath the afternoon sun. You can ask. Why did you never leave this town? Caleb smiled faintly. After my wife passed away, everyone told me to start over somewhere bigger. Better opportunities. Better money. But Owen already lost enough. I could not ask him to lose home too. Audrey looked at him with quiet respect. Most people would have chosen differently. Maybe, Caleb replied. But children remember who stayed beside them more than they remember who chased success. Audrey said nothing else. His answer lingered in the truck like a truth that needed no explanation. When they arrived back at the garage, however, the peaceful rhythm of the day had changed. 2 expensive luxury sedans were parked in front of the building, and 3 men wearing tailored business suits stood examining the property while speaking with clipboards in their hands. One of them was measuring the front parking lot. Another was taking photographs of the building from different angles. Caleb frowned. Can I help you, gentlemen? The oldest of the 3 offered a brief professional smile. Good afternoon. We are conducting a preliminary property evaluation. Caleb folded his arms. For what purpose? The man handed him a business card bearing the name of a national commercial development company. Our client is purchasing several adjoining properties to build a regional distribution center. This garage falls within the proposed expansion area. Caleb studied the card in silence before looking back at the man. This property is not for sale. The representative remained polite. Many owners say that at first. We are prepared to make a generous offer. Caleb shook his head without hesitation. I appreciate the offer, but my answer is still no. The 3 men exchanged brief glances before gathering their materials and returning to their vehicles. They left without arguing. Yet something about their calm confidence unsettled him. It was almost as though they expected his answer to change. Audrey watched the entire exchange from several feet away. Her expression remained composed, but the warmth that had accompanied her throughout the day quietly disappeared. Did you know about this? Caleb asked. She answered immediately. No. He believed her. Still, she seemed to recognize the company name before quickly looking away. That evening the garage felt unusually quiet again. Owen helped organize tools while Caleb inspected a customer's pickup truck, trying unsuccessfully to push the conversation from his mind. As the sun began to sink below the trees, the familiar rumble of Walter's restored Jeep echoed into the parking lot once more. The retired pilot climbed out with the same peaceful smile Caleb remembered. I heard someone paid your garage a visit today, Walter said. Caleb nodded. Word travels fast around here. Walter looked toward the highway for a long moment before quietly replying. Some visitors arrive because they see land. Others arrive because they see value. Before this story ends, you are going to discover which kind came looking for you. And when that day comes, the choice you make will matter far more than anything you repaired. Walter remained only a few minutes before climbing back into his restored Jeep, leaving behind another sentence that settled deeply into Caleb's mind. The hardest decision is rarely about keeping something, the retired pilot had said with a quiet smile. Sometimes it is about understanding why it was entrusted to you in the first place. The familiar engine faded into the distance, and evening slowly wrapped Ashford in golden light. Over the next several days, life appeared to return to normal. Caleb repaired brake systems, replaced alternators, changed oil, and helped neighbors who had become more like family than customers. Owen hurried home after school each afternoon, finishing homework at the same wooden workbench while proudly handing his father the right wrench before Caleb even asked for it. Yet beneath that comforting routine, something invisible had begun to shift. Audrey returned often, but never with lawyers or executives. Instead, she arrived alone, sometimes bringing coffee, sometimes carrying old maintenance records from Walter's collection, and sometimes simply sitting quietly while Caleb explained why one engine deserved rebuilding while another deserved careful preservation. She listened far more than she spoke. The more she watched him work, the more she realized that his greatest skill had very little to do with mechanical knowledge. He treated every customer with exactly the same respect, whether they drove a 30-year-old sedan or a brand-new luxury truck. One chilly Thursday afternoon, an elderly schoolteacher arrived with a faded station wagon that barely started. Caleb spent nearly an hour diagnosing the problem before discovering it required only a loose electrical connection that took less than 5 minutes to repair. When the grateful woman asked what she owed, Caleb smiled exactly as he had smiled at Walter. "Nothing today. Just promise me you will spend that money on your grandchildren instead." Audrey happened to witness the entire conversation from across the garage. "You do realize she would have gladly paid you," she said after the teacher drove away. Caleb shrugged while closing his toolbox. "She spent 40 years teaching children. I think she has already paid enough." Audrey lowered her eyes, thoughtful once again. "Most business owners calculate profit differently. Maybe that is why I own only a small garage," Caleb answered with a quiet laugh. She smiled, but her expression quickly became serious. "Perhaps that is exactly why Walter chose you." Before Caleb could ask another question, his cell phone rang. The caller was the county clerk's office. After a brief conversation, his smile faded. "Thank you for letting me know," he said calmly before ending the call. Audrey immediately noticed the change in his face. "What happened?" Caleb slipped the phone back into his pocket. "There is going to be a public zoning meeting next Tuesday evening. Apparently, the development company officially submitted plans to purchase nearly every property along this side of the highway." Audrey remained silent for a moment longer than usual. "Including this garage?" Caleb nodded. "Including this garage." The autumn breeze drifted through the open bay doors, carrying dry leaves across the concrete floor as though nature itself had paused to listen. Owen looked up from his homework. "Are we going to lose the shop?" Caleb walked over and rested a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "We are not borrowing tomorrow's worries today." Owen accepted the answer with a quiet nod, trusting his father completely. Audrey watched the exchange with unmistakable admiration. Then she reached into her bag and removed a sealed envelope bearing her company's official logo. She placed it gently on the workbench, but did not slide it toward Caleb. "Inside is information you deserve to know before Tuesday," she said softly. "It may change the way you see everything that has happened since Walter first drove into your garage." Caleb looked at the unopened envelope without touching it. The brass compass inside his jacket suddenly felt heavier than ever, and for reasons he could not explain, he sensed that whatever waited inside that envelope was connected not only to the future of his little garage, but also to the mysterious photograph Audrey had chosen to keep hidden from him since the very first day they met. Tuesday evening arrived beneath a sky brushed with soft shades of orange and blue as nearly the entire town of Ashford gathered inside the old community hall. Farmers still wearing dusty boots sat beside teachers, mechanics, nurses, veterans, and small business owners whose families had lived there for generations. Caleb took a seat near the back with Owen beside him, the brass compass resting quietly in his jacket pocket, while the sealed envelope Audrey had given him remained unopened in his truck exactly where he had left it. He had made a decision the night before. Whatever truth waited inside could wait one more day. He wanted to hear people before papers. At precisely 6 o'clock, the county commissioner welcomed everyone and invited representatives from the development company to present their proposal. Large architectural drawings appeared on a projection screen, showing a modern distribution center stretching across hundreds of acres. The spokesman explained projected jobs, increased tax revenue, and economic growth with polished confidence. When the presentation ended, he pointed toward the highlighted properties scheduled for acquisition. Caleb's garage stood directly in the center of the map. Quiet murmurs spread through the audience. Then the commissioner invited public comments. Several residents expressed concern about preserving the character of the town. Others welcomed new employment opportunities. Caleb remained silent, listening carefully to every opinion without interrupting anyone. Finally, the spokesman addressed him directly. "Mr. Hayes, your garage is one of the final properties we require. We are prepared to offer a generous amount well above market value." Caleb slowly stood. His voice remained calm enough that everyone leaned forward to hear him. "I appreciate the offer, but this building is more than real estate. My father worked here. My son is growing up here. Every dent in those walls carries someone's story. Some things become valuable because people refuse to replace them. The room fell unusually quiet. Before the company representative could respond, the rear doors of the hall opened. Walter Dawson entered slowly, wearing the same weathered flight jacket Caleb had seen on the first afternoon they met. Beside him walked Audrey Mitchell carrying the familiar leather folder. Every conversation stopped. Walter reached the front of the room and smiled warmly at the commissioner. "May I say something before this meeting continues?" Permission was granted immediately. Walter looked around the crowded hall before speaking. "Many of you believe Miss Mitchell came here because she owns a successful company. That is only part of the story." Audrey stepped forward and opened the leather folder. This time she removed the photograph she had hidden since the beginning. She handed it to Caleb first. His eyes widened the instant he saw it. The picture showed this very garage nearly 30 years earlier. Standing beside the same building was his late father, smiling proudly next to Walter and the very same Jeep. Caleb looked up speechless. Walter nodded gently. "Your father restored that Jeep after one of the hardest years of my life. I tried to pay him. He refused." The room remained completely silent. Walter continued with a steady voice. "Before I left, he told me something I never forgot. He said, 'If you ever find someone who carries kindness forward the same way, help them before they know they need it.'" Caleb felt his throat tighten. He had never heard those words before. Walter smiled toward Audrey. "I did not spend 40 years searching for a mechanic. I spent 40 years waiting to see whether his son had inherited his heart." Audrey quietly unfolded one final document. It was not a purchase agreement. It was a recorded preservation trust established years earlier by Walter and funded by Audrey's family, permanently protecting the garage, the hangar collection, and the surrounding property as a community heritage workshop. The development company representative slowly closed his briefcase without saying another word. The entire hall stood frozen in respectful silence. Then Walter looked at the brass compass still resting in Caleb's hand and smiled one last time. "Those numbers were never coordinates," he said softly. "They were the date your father first repaired my Jeep, because that was the day he quietly restored far more than an old machine. None of us realized until today that he was also restoring your future."